Her name was Docia Ransom. On a gray morning in the fall of 1883, the land agent for Wexford County slid a stack of papers across his counter and smiled at her. He smiled like a man who'd sold the bottom of the barrel and was glad to be rid of it. The quarter he gave her was the flooded one, the low piece. The one with the spring-fed pond that drowned every crop a person tried to set in it. The ink wasn't even dry before three neighbors out on the plank walk had a name for what she'd done. The widow's folly, they called it. Docia didn't argue. That same evening she knelt at the edge of that pond with a string knotted every foot, and she measured how deep the water went, and she wrote the number in a ledger, and she said nothing at all. A week later, at the Brush Arbor Church social, a man named Hollis Pruitt said it loud enough for the 40 families under the arbor to hear. "You bought a mud hole a mule wouldn't drink from. People like you always get handed the land the rest of us walked past." And the women looked down at their plates so they wouldn't have to look at her. Then came January. The first hard freeze. Before light, Docia walked out alone onto the black ice of that pond with a handsaw and a pair of worn tongs. If you've ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe to the channel and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me tell you the whole of it. Slow and true. From the beginning, Ambrose sat in the eastern corner of Kansas, where the tall grass gave up and the wheat took over. In the autumn of 1883, it was still half a town. A depot. A grain elevator going up on credit. A single street of false front stores that turned to mud when it rained, and to bone white ruts when it didn't. Docia had come there 3 years back, part of the Great Leaving. The Exodus, when word ran through the old country that Kansas was giving land to any hand that could hold it. She had come north with a trunk, a Bible, and a skill nobody thought to ask a woman about. She knew ice. Not the eating of it. The cutting of it. Back east she had worked 3 winters on other men's ponds, sawing blocks in the cold before the sun was up, floating them down the channels, hauling them dripping into the sawdust dark of somebody else's ice house. Here in Kansas she'd done it too, one more season, for 40 cents a day. 40 cents, and her back bent double, and her hands so cold they forgot they were hands. And every summer she watched the men who owned the water sell that same ice for $4 and $5 a ton to the butchers and the creameries and the railroad. She hauled the fortune. She never held a dollar of it. The water was always somebody else's water. So when the land agent offered her the quarter nobody else would file on, Docia Ransom said yes before he finished the sentence. He thought he'd cheated her. She let him think it. That was the thing about being watched all your life. You learn to keep your face like a shut door. The quarter was 160 acres of the wrong kind of ground. Low, boggy on its northern half, cut through by a fold in the land where the water gathered, and in the middle of that fold sat the pond, spring-fed, cold at the bottom even in August, a good 4 acres of open water that rose every thaw and rotted the roots of anything a fool tried to plant near it. Every settler who came through Wexford County had looked at that pond and looked away. Ground you couldn't plow was ground with no God in it. That was the plains gospel. A man measured his worth in furrows. Docia measured hers in a ledger, by lantern light, kneeling on the frozen mud with a knotted string running out of her hand and down into the black. 11 feet at the center. She wrote it down. She did not smile, but something behind her ribs went still and warm, the way it does when a long sum finally comes out even. She thought of Ezra then. She always did, at the water's edge. Old Ezra, the freedman who'd taught her the trade back east, a man with hands like carved walnut and a way of holding a sawed block up to the low winter sun. "Look here, girl," he'd say. "Clear ice you can read a newspaper through. Cloudy ice is water that lied to you. It froze too fast, or it froze dirty, and it'll melt on you by June." He taught her to read water the way other people read scripture, to know which pond ran clean and cold from a spring, and which was just standing rain that would betray you. He taught her that a pond was not a hole in the ground. A pond was a field that harvested itself every winter and asked nothing of the dirt. She had learned to read water for a living long before she owned a single inch of it. Now she owned 4 acres of the best reading water in the county, and not one soul in Ambrose knew what that meant. They only knew what they'd decided about her. The town had 2 verdicts, and it wore them both. The first was pity. That poor woman got sold a swamp, the church ladies murmured, shaking their heads over their sewing. Somebody ought to have warned her, as if a warning would have changed a mind they never troubled to ask. The second verdict was scorn, and it lived mostly in Hollis Pruitt. Pruitt held the claim next to hers, up on the high dry ground to the west. He'd come to Kansas with a notion of cattle. A herd, a brand, a spread a man could be somebody on. But he'd come at the wrong time. 2 dry summers in a row had burned his grass to straw and dropped his stock ponds to cracked mud. His cattle walked the fence line lowing at the one thing in the county that never went dry. Docia's pond. He had meant to file on that low quarter himself, someday when he got the money together, and turn the pond into a stock tank that would water his herd through any drought Kansas could throw. He'd waited too long. A freedwoman had walked in and taken it out from under him for the price of a filing fee, and the shame of that sat in him like a stone he couldn't pass. He told himself it wouldn't last. A claim like hers was a soft thing, he figured. The county had ways of undoing what it didn't like. All he had to do was wait and lean and be certain. And Hollis Pruitt was a certain man. One afternoon that fall, coming back from the depot with an empty flour sack, Docia passed the railroad eating house at the edge of the depot yard. It was a long, low building where the Midland and Pacific fed its passengers when the train stopped. Through the open door she could see the counter, the long tables, a man in his shirt sleeves frowning over a ledger of his own. And she said something then, quiet, only to herself. The way a person does when a thing is too large to say out loud. No cold anywhere in this town, but a well and a prayer. She didn't know yet that she'd just said the whole of her future in 8 words. Neither did anybody else. But she felt it settle in her, that thought, and she carried it home. The man in the shirt sleeves was Elias Hartzell. He bought the ice for that eating house, or tried to. He was a widower, near 40, with a girl of 7 and a wagon that made the long haul to the division town whenever the ice ran short, which was often. That autumn, it was short again. His supplier east of the county line had run thin, and the eating house couldn't keep butter or beef or a pitcher of anything cold. He was a tired man with a hard problem, and when Docia Ransom stopped at his door one day and told him she'd have ice come January, he half listened. People said all kinds of things. "My pond," she said. "It'll carry 300 tons of it, come the freeze. Clear ice. Railroad grade." He looked up from his ledger. He was a plain-faced man, not unkind, only worn down to the grain. 300 tons, he said. Give or take. He almost laughed. Not at her. At the size of it, the notion of 300 tons of anything coming out of that drowned quarter, everybody pitied her for. But he didn't laugh, because there was something in the flat, sure way she said it that didn't leave room. "Well," he said, "January's a ways off." "It always comes," Docia said, and left. He thought about it that night longer than he meant to. The church social came at the end of October. A brush arbor down by the creek, poles and cut cedar for a roof, 40 families spread out on quilts and plank benches with baskets of cold chicken and pie. It was the whole county in one place. Docia went because staying away would have said more than going. She wore her good dress, the dark one, and she kept to the edge. And she was helping cut a peach pie for the children when Hollis Pruitt found his voice. He'd had a taste of something from a jar, maybe. His face was up. He stood where the most people could hear him, and he aimed himself at her across the open ground. "There she is," he said. "The Swamp Queen. A few men laughed the way men do when they're nervous and glad it's not them. Docia Ransom. You bought a mud hole a mule wouldn't drink from, and you paid the government for the privilege. People like you always get handed the land the rest of us walked past. That's how it works, isn't it? Somebody's got to take the bottom of the pile. The arbor went quiet. That particular quiet that is worse than shouting. Docia stood with the pie knife in her hand and did not put it down and did not raise it. She looked at him. And the women, 40 women who knew exactly what was happening and exactly how wrong it was, looked down at their plates. Every one of them. They studied their chicken and their pie so they would not have to meet her eyes, because meeting her eyes would have cost them something with Pruitt and with their husbands, and with the shape of the world as they'd agreed to keep it. That was the second cut, and it was deeper than the first. The scorn she could stand. The turning away was what got in under the dress and touched the heart. Then a man's voice said, "That's a poor way to talk to a neighbor, Hollis." It was Elias Hartzell. He was standing near the cedar posts with his daughter's hand in his, and he'd said it plain, not loud, the way you'd correct a thing that was simply beneath the room. The woman filed on open land like anybody. There's no shame in it, I can see. It wasn't a speech. It was 6 seconds of ordinary decency, but the whole arbor heard a railroad man, a white widower with a good post, and a name people respected, speak civilly to the freedwoman with the swamp. And the county filed that away too. It judged her for being spoken to, and it judged him for the speaking. You could feel it move through the crowd like a change in the weather. Docia felt it. She'd have rather he stayed quiet. Almost. Pruitt muttered something and turned away to find his jar, and the social went back to its noise, and that was that. Except that a small person let go of her father's hand and crossed the open ground to Docia, the way only a child will walk straight through a thing every adult is stepping around. Nell Hartzell, 7 years old, all elbows and curiosity, with her father's plain face made new. She stopped in front of Docia and looked up. "Does your pond freeze hard?" she asked. "Hard enough to walk on?" The whole arbor was still half watching. Docia knelt down so she was level with the girl, and something in her face eased that hadn't eased all evening. "Hard enough to build on," she said. Nell's eyes went wide with the pleasure of an answer that big, and she nodded like they'd settled important business, and she ran back to her father. And Docia Ransom stood up in the middle of a county that had just looked away from her, and for the first time since the land agent smiled at her, she felt something that wasn't only her own stubborn spine holding her up. The winter came the way it always comes. Slow, then all at once. January of 1884 dropped down out of Canada like a lid on a pot. The creek stilled. The mud went iron. And the pond on the flooded quarter froze the way a spring-fed pond freezes when nothing muddies it, from the top down, clean and clear and hard. Docia walked out onto it in the dark of the first truly hard morning, testing it with her heel, listening to it talk under her the way ice talks, those long, deep, booming notes that scare a person who doesn't know them and comfort a person who does. It held. She had spent the fall getting ready. She'd bought a proper ice saw and a set of tongs and a marking plow second-hand, and she'd cut and hauled sawdust from the mill by the wagon load and heaped it beside the landing under canvas. Now, she started to work. Nobody helped her. Nobody offered. She scored the ice into a grid with the marking plow, walking the horse in straight, patient lines the way Ezra had taught her, so the blocks would come out square and true. Then she sawed. It is brutal work, the sawing, the long blade biting down through a foot and more of ice, the cold coming up through your boots and the wet freezing on your sleeves. And she did it alone in the blue dark before dawn and on into the short bright days. When a block came free, she floated it down the open channel she kept chopped through the ice, hooked it with the tongs, and dragged it up a plank ramp to the sledge, block by block. Then up to the ice house she'd raised on the landing, a plain, double-walled shed, and packed each block in sawdust so it lay in the dark like a stone in wool, insulated from June, from July, from August. That was the whole secret the town didn't know. Cut in January. Keep till summer. Sell when there's no cold to be had for love or money. Her first block, the very first she pulled clear that season, she held up to the rising sun before she packed it away. Clear straight through. You could have read a newspaper laid behind it. Ezra would have nodded. Water that never lied. She sold that ice as spring turned to heat. First to the town butcher, who bought it grudging, and then, when it kept his meat 2 days longer than the well ever had, came back less grudging. Then, the creamery, who needed cold the way a body needs breath, and had been shipping their butter east soft and losing money on every crock. Then, in June, Elias Hartzell walked down to the landing himself and stood looking at the ice house and the sawdust and the woman in the man's coat, and he bought ice for the railroad, eating house at $4.50 a ton. The same trade that had paid her 40 cents a day to do the hauling now paid her $4.50 a ton to own the water. She wrote that number in her ledger, too. She looked at it a long time. Elias came often after that, for the eating house needed a great deal of cold, and Docia had it. And in the small ways that a person shows another person a thing they'd never say, he began to look out for her. At the landing where the wagons loaded there was a lee, a sheltered spot behind the icehouse wall where the wind didn't cut, and he took to hanging back so she could stand in it while they settled the weights, taking the raw edge of the wind on his own back instead. He never said a word about it. He just shifted, and left her the warm corner, and she noticed, and said nothing either. One morning she came out to find her tongs mended. She'd split a handle the day before, a bad crack that would have cost her a day to fix, and she'd left the tool leaning by the icehouse door, meaning to see to it. In the night somebody had taken it, drawn the split closed, wrapped and pinned a new handle of good ash, and set it back exactly where it stood. No note. No word the next day, or the day after. But she knew Elias Hartzell's hands by then, the square careful work of them, and she knew what it was to be a woman alone whose tools somebody mended in the dark, for no reason but kindness, and she carried that with her longer than she carried Pruett's speech. Because Pruett had not gone quiet. Pruett had watched her ice go out to the butcher and the creamery and his own eating house all spring, watched the drowned quarter he'd sneered at start to pay, and it did not soften him. It set him harder. In the middle of that first summer he rode down to the landing and sat his horse and looked at her working and told her what he'd come to tell her. "You've had your fun," he said, "but that water's wasted on frozen games. My stock is dying up on that high ground for want of it. You let me open that pond into a tank, run it downhill to my cattle, and I'll pay you a fair lease. Be reasonable. That water was meant to grow beef, not to be sawed up and sold to strangers." Docia straightened from the block she was weighing. "The pond stays a pond," she said. "You don't understand what you're holding. I understand it better than any man in this county." His face changed then, the reason going out of it. "That quarter was never meant to be held," he said, low, "not by you. There's men who'll see to that, when they've a mind to." And he turned his horse and rode back up to his dry high ground. It was not the last she would hear of it. It was the first shape of a thing that was coming for her with paper and a seal, though she didn't know that yet. She only knew the threat, and she went back to her weighing, and her hands were steady, but she wrote no number in her ledger for a while. She just stood in the lee Elias had left her and watched the dust of Pruett's going. The heat came up hard that year. By the middle of July, the whole county lay flat under a white sky, the corn curling, the wells low, the wind like breath from an open oven, and all across Ambrose, meat spoiled, and milk soured, and butter ran, everywhere except the tables and the creamery crocks and the eating house that Docia Ransom's ice reached. Her wagons went out at first light packed in sawdust and came back empty, and where they went there was cold, and where they didn't there was ruin. People began to notice that. People who'd looked at their plates in the arbor began to send their boys down to the landing with a nickel and a bucket. Slow, grudging still. But they came. It was in that heat that Elias made her the offer that would change everything, though it came out of him plain as anything else he'd ever said. He came down late one evening after the last train, when the light was going gold and long over the water and the day's heat was finally lifting off the ground. Nell was with him, running ahead to the pond's edge to look for the frogs. He stood by the wagon and turned his hat in his hands the way a careful man does before a careful thing. "The eating house can't live on buckets and hope," he said. "I've talked to the division. They'll stand behind a real supply, not a load here and a load there. A season's worth, guaranteed, 300 tons across next summer, cut and kept and delivered as we need it." He looked at her. "I want it from you, Docia. I've watched you work a year. There's not another operation in 3 counties I'd trust it to. Give me your hand on it, and it's done." 300 tons, the number she'd said to him standing in his doorway last fall, when he'd near laughed at her. The whole of her season, spoken for, secured, at $4.50 a ton, and no summer's worry about who'd buy. It was everything. It was the thing she had come north for, the thing she had knelt in the frozen mud with a knotted string to find, and Docia Ransom stood there on her own landing, on her own water, with the man who mended her tongs in the dark holding out his hand to make her fortune, and she felt her whole body go cold and careful and afraid. Because she knew what a hand on it was worth. She had shaken hands on wages before. She had done the work and hauled the ice and waited for the pay that came short, or came late, or did not come at all, and there was never any paper to hold up against a man who decided a handshake meant less than he'd let on. A handshake was a thing they could unsay. A handshake, given by her, to a white man, in a county that had already decided what she was, could vanish like breath on a January morning and leave her with nothing but her word against his. And she knew exactly what her word was worth in Ambrose. Elias stood with his hand out and his good plain face open, meaning every bit of it. And everything in her that was still bent double over other men's ice, everything that had ever been cheated, rose up and told her to say no. "Not on a handshake," Docia said. His hand didn't drop right away. "You don't trust me. It isn't you." Her voice came out lower than she meant. "It's every man that ever wasn't you." She made herself look at him. Out on the pond, Nell called something about a bullfrog, and neither of them turned. "You want 300 tons from me, Elias Hartzell. You'll put it on paper. Written, dated, what I cut, what you pay, when you pay it. A contract in my own name that this county cannot unsay when it decides it doesn't like the look of me getting rich off a swamp." The gold light lay on the water between them. Somewhere behind, in the icehouse dark, a year of winter waited in sawdust for a summer that hadn't come yet. And Elias Hartzell looked at the woman on the landing a long moment, and Docia looked back, and neither of them yet knew that the paper she was asking for would one day be the only thing standing between her and the loss of everything. Held up in a warm room at the county seat, while a man in a collar argued that a freedwoman had never truly owned a thing in her life, she only knew she had asked. And she waited, in the dying light, to see what he would say. For a long moment the pond was the only thing that spoke. A fish turned somewhere out in the reeds. The gold light thinned toward gray. Then Elias Hartzell let his hand fall, and he smiled, not hurt, the way she'd braced for, but something closer to relief. "Good," he said. Docia thought she'd misheard him. "Good. A man who won't put it on paper is a man planning to change his mind." He looked at her steady. "I've been changed on by papermen my whole life. You want it written, Docia Ransom? I'll have it written. Dated. Your name at the top of it. 300 tons, $4.50 the ton, paid on delivery, half in spring against the season." He nodded once, like a thing decided. "I'll bring it Thursday. You read it as long as you please." Out on the water, Nell shrieked that she'd found the bullfrog, held it up dripping, and neither of them was cold anymore. He came Thursday. He came in a clean collar with a folded sheet in his coat, and he set it on the ledger board at the landing and stood back with his hat in his hands like a man in church. Docia read it once. Then she read it again, her finger under every line, the way old Ezra had taught her to read water, slow and twice, and trusting nothing that hurried her. It said what he'd said. No more, no less. 300 tons. 450 the ton. Her name, her whole name, Docia Ransom, spelled right at the head of it, above his. She'd never once seen her name written above a white man's on anything. "There's a place for me to sign," she said. Her voice wasn't steady, and she let it not be. "There's a place for us both." She dipped the pen. She wrote her name in the hand she'd taught herself by lamplight, letter by careful letter, and the ink went down black and stayed. Then she straightened, and she looked at him, and for the first time she let his given name out into the open air, where the county could hear it. Then, "It's done. Elias." He heard it. She watched him hear it. A man's whole face can change on a single word, and his did, and he didn't say anything foolish about it, which was how she knew he was worth the word. Summer came down on the plains like a lid on a pot. By the middle of July there was no mercy left in the sky. The corn curled. The creeks he'd bragged on went to cracked mud. The heat sat on Ambrose day and night and would not lift, and everywhere in that town meat went gray, and milk went thick, and the smell of it drifted out of every door that didn't have her ice behind it. But Docia's wagons kept coming. Before light each morning she went to the ice house on the landing. She dug down through the sawdust with her hands, and there it was, winter. Kept. The blocks came up sweating and clear, cold enough to ache your teeth to stand near, and she loaded them under canvas and wet burlap and sent them into a town that was cooking alive. The butcher's meat kept. The creamery's butter came firm to the counter. And at the railroad eating house, where the Midland and Pacific set down 40 hungry passengers twice a day with 20 minutes to eat, the water was cold, and the meat was sound, and the pie didn't run. All summer, while every other table between here and the division burned. People began to notice which doors stayed cool. They noticed the way the swamp woman's wagons rolled up the main street of Ambrose at 7 in the morning, dripping a dark line down the dust, and they noticed that the coolest, soundest, most wanted thing in the whole parched county came off a claim they'd all called the widow's folly. The women who'd looked at their plates under the arbor now stood in their doorways and watched her pass. Some of them, when they wanted a block for a sick child or a Sunday churn, came to the landing themselves. They didn't quite meet her eye when they paid. But they paid. And they carried her ice home in their own arms. That was the summer the arithmetic finally spoke plain, to the county and to Docia both. Because here was the thing nobody in Ambrose had let themselves see. Wheat asked everything of a man. It asked the plow, and the seed, and the rain that wouldn't come, and the hail, and the rust, and the price at the elevator that some man in a far city set without asking you. A dry summer could take it all. But ice. Ice was a crop that planted itself. It asked nothing of the soil, not one thing, not a furrow, not a seed, not a prayer for rain. It fell out of the January sky and lay down on the water and made itself, thick and clear and heavy, every single winter, whether you deserved it or not. All it cost was the labor to cut it and the sawdust to keep it. And in a country with no cold in it anywhere but a well and a prayer, a wagon load of that January crop, sold in July, brought more than a wagon load of wheat ever had. The flooded quarter that no settler would take, the mudhole a mule wouldn't drink from. It was the richest claim in Wexford County. And it always had been. It had only been waiting for one person who'd spent 3 years bent double, cutting other men's ice for 40 cents a day, long enough to learn to read cold the way other people read print. Hollis Pruitt came to the landing to see it for himself. He came on a good horse across the dry section line, and he sat looking at her wagons, at the double-walled ice house, at the sawdust heaped under canvas, at the crew of townsmen she'd hired now to load. He'd wanted that water for his cattle. He'd wanted it drained to a stock tank to keep his herd alive through this very drought that was killing them by the head out on his grass. And here it lay, deep and cold and full, growing money for the woman he'd shamed in front of 40 families. All this off a swamp, he said. He meant it to cut. It came out closer to bewildered. Docia set down her tongs. She wiped her hands. She looked at him a good while before she answered, and when she did, she said it quiet, no heat in it at all, which is the way a true thing is best said. You saw a swamp, Mr. Pruitt? She let it sit. I saw a crop that freezes solid every winter and asks nothing of the dirt. He had no answer for that. There isn't one. He turned his horse and rode back across his dying grass, and Docia watched him go and did not feel the triumph she'd once thought she'd feel. She felt tired, and she felt right, and those two things sat together in her chest like ice and sawdust, keeping, it was Elias who told her, finally, why he'd made himself an iceman. It came out on an evening at the landing, both of them worn flat from the heat, Nell asleep in the wagon bed under a coat. He was watching Docia dig a block out of the sawdust, and he said, not looking at her, "You know why I chase this stuff so hard. The ice. For the railroad," she said. For the eating house. For Sarah. He said the name carefully, like it still had an edge. 2 winters back. She took a fever in the deep of it, and it wouldn't break, and the doctor said cold. Get the fever cold. Pack her. Cool the room. And there wasn't any. He turned the word over. 20 miles of prairie and a railroad running through it, and not 1 pound of ice in the whole division in January, because nobody in this country ever thought to keep the winter when it came. I stood in a house full of snow I couldn't use and watched her burn. The pond ticked and settled in the dark. So when a woman rode into Ambrose talking about 300 tons kept in sawdust, he said, half the town heard a swamp. I heard the thing I couldn't get for my wife. He finally looked at her. Grief made me an iceman. Docia, you made me a partner. Those are 2 different things, and I know the difference, and I wanted you to know I know it. She didn't say anything for a while. Some things you honor with quiet. Then she reached into the sawdust and brought up a clear block, small, and she carried it to where the last light came off the water, and she held it up to the sun the way old Ezra had held one up to a winter sky 30 years, and 1,000 miles ago. Nell, she said, and the child stirred and came, rubbing her eyes. Look here, look through it. The block was clear as a window pane, clear as truth, and the low sun came through it and threw a coin of gold light on the girl's dirty cheek. You can read the water in it, Docia said. Clear ice you can read a newspaper through. Cloudy ice is water that lied to you when it froze. She turned the block, and the light turned with it. This water never lied to me once. Nell put her small hand flat against the cold face of it and left it there until it hurt, laughing, and Elias watched his daughter and the freedwoman with the swamp, and there was no more quiet in him that could be called decency. There was just a man who'd made up his mind. Which was exactly when Hollis Pruitt, having failed to buy the water and failed to drain it, went and bought the law instead. The first Docia knew of it, a man she'd never seen came to the landing in a town suit with dust on his shoes. "Mr. Deering," he said. Wexford Land and Loan. He had a leather folder and a soft voice, and the manner of a man who has never once had to do a hard thing with his own hands. He offered her $260 to sign the quarter over and go. Docia laughed. She didn't mean to. It came out of her like a cough. $260 for the richest cold in 3 counties. He didn't blink. That was the tell. A man who didn't blink at his own low number was a man who already had the second card in his hand. "I'll keep my claim," she said. "I thought you might." He drew the papers out of the folder without any hurry at all. Then, "Miss Pruitt is obliged to contest it. There's a question, you see, whether your claim was ever properly proved up." He laid it out gentle, almost kind, the way you'd explain a hard thing to a child. "The Homestead Act asks for improvements to the soil. Cultivation, farming. Now, a pond isn't farming. An ice house isn't a crop. Some might argue," and there it was, the soft knife, "that a woman in your position never truly established a bona fide claim to begin with. You've 90 days to answer at the district land office, at the county seat. Or you can take the 260 and save yourself the trip." He left the papers on the ledger board. He tipped his hat to her. He drove away. Ice is not farming. A freedwoman never truly owned a thing in her life. She stood at the landing with the summer sun beating down, and the whole thing she'd built humming around her, the ice house, the crew, the wagons, the contract in her own name, and a man in a town suit had just told her the county could reach out any time it liked and take it, because of what she was. And the same week, they got to Elias. She heard it herself. She'd driven a load in to the eating house at dusk, and she came up quiet on the loading side, and through the open door she heard the division superintendent's voice, a man named Corliss. All business. Not going to say it twice, Hartzell, a company man carrying on open with the colored woman off the swamp claim, is a thing the road can't have. It's noticed. It's talked about. A pause. Drop the deliveries. There's other ice. That contract of hers can be reassigned quiet, and you can keep your post, and we forget this. Or you keep on, and you don't have a post to keep. Your choice. But it isn't much of one. Docia stood in the dark against the warm boards and heard Elias Hartzell's whole living being weighed against her name and found wanting. She didn't wait to hear his answer. She was afraid of both answers. If he chose her, he'd be ruined, and if he chose the road, she couldn't have borne to watch his face while he did it. So she did the thing she'd learned to do her whole life. She protected the person she loved by taking herself out of his way. That night, she drove to his house. She didn't knock. On the seat of his wagon, where he'd find it first thing, she laid the tongs. Her split tongs that he'd mended in the dark and left at her ice house door without a word, the ones she'd carried like a secret all summer. She laid them on the seat, and she left. He'd know what it meant. Take these back. It's finished. I won't be the thing that ruins you. She halted his deliveries. She sent word she was releasing him from the contract, no fault, and she meant it as the last gift she had to give a man who'd been straight with her when nobody else would. She'd fight the county alone. She'd learned everything alone. She could lose alone, too, if it came to that. She had 90 days. She spent them getting ready for a fight in a warm room. The hearing was held at the district land office at the county seat, and the whole of Ambrose seemed to have found business at the county seat that day. They filled the benches. Pruitt was there in a new coat. Deering sat with his leather folder and his soft voice. And the register, the government man who'd decide, sat behind a desk with the July heat pressing at the windows and a pitcher of water going warm beside his hand. Deering spoke first, and he spoke well, the way soft knives do. "The claim is unimproved swamp," he said. "The act was written for men who break the prairie and raise a crop from the soil. This claimant broke nothing, raised nothing. She dug a pond that God already dug, and she stacked frozen water in a shed. That is not farming. That is not improvement. That is not," he said, and let his eyes rest a moment on Docia, where she sat, the sort of bona fide enterprise the law was ever meant to protect. "The claim should be canceled, and the quarter opened to a settler who will use it as the Congress intended." There was a murmur. Some of it agreed with him. Then the register looked at Docia and said, "You may answer." She stood. She'd worn her plain dark dress, and she'd worn it clean, and she walked to the front of that warm room with her back straight and a folded contract in her hand. And she was not fast, and she was not loud, and every eye in 3 counties was on her. "He says I raised nothing," she began. "Let me show you what the quarter grows." She'd asked leave to bring a thing in, and they'd let her, thinking it a curiosity. 2 of her crewmen carried it in now, under wet canvas, and set it on the corner of the register's own desk, and she drew the canvas off. A block of pond ice, clear as a window pane. Cut that January, kept all summer in sawdust, and hauled to the county seat through the worst heat the plains had thrown in 10 years. In that hot room it stood up hard and cold and dripping, throwing back the light off every clean facet of it, and 40 families leaned to see it, and it did not melt away to nothing. It stood. It kept. "There's the crop," Docia said quiet. "Grown in January. Sold in July. It asks nothing of the soil, because it is not the soil's to give. Mr. Deering calls it no improvement." She set her hand flat on the desk beside the block. "This county lost meat and milk all summer for the want of it. My wagons kept the railroad eating house cold, and the creamery and the butcher, when every other door in Ambrose was spoiling. If keeping a whole town fed through a killing summer is not improvement, sir, then I don't know what the word was ever meant to mean." Then she laid the papers on the desk beside the melting block. The affidavits, the butcher's, the creamery man's, sworn, the proof of her residence, her sworn winters on the claim, 3 of them now. The ice house, double-walled, standing on the landing where any man could ride out and see it. And on top, unfolded flat, the written, dated railroad supply contract. 300 tons, $4.50 the ton, Docia Ransom's own name, written at the head of it, above Elias Hartzell's. "A bona fide enterprise," she said. "In my own name. Dated. Signed. Read your paper through the ice, sir, if you doubt it's clear. I've nothing in this claim that won't stand the light." The register looked a long time at the block on his desk. Water ran off it and darkened his blotter. He looked at the contract. He looked at the woman. And that was the moment the door at the back of the room came open, and Elias Hartzell walked in. He walked in against every order the railroad had given him, in front of the superintendent who sat right there on the bench, in front of the whole county, and he took off his hat, and he asked the register's leave to speak. "I buy the ice," he said, "for the Midland and Pacific Eating House at the division. I've bought ice 3 years. I never in my life had a supplier I could set my watch by till this one." He didn't look at Corliss. He looked at the government man. Every delivery, on time, kept cold, through the worst summer I've seen. There's not an operation more honest in 3 counties, and I've dealt with all of them. If the road wants to call that woman's claim a swamp, the road can find another eating house, because I won't stand here and let a soft-handed man tell this office that Docia Ransom raised nothing. She raised the only cold this county had. I'd stake my post on it. "You are staking your post on it, Hartzell," Corliss said from the bench, low and hard. "Then, I've staked it." Elias set his hat back on. "I resign the division post as of this morning. I'll not carry ice for a road that asks me to lie about who cut it." He looked at Docia then, once, and it was the plainest thing his plain good face had ever said. "I'd sooner be poor and straight than kept and crooked." I learned that from her. The room did not know what to do with itself. Somewhere a woman began to cry and tried to hide it. The register cleared his throat. He set his hand flat on the pile of Docia's papers, the sworn affidavits and the residence and the dated contract, and beside it the block of January ice stood in the July heat and would not disappear. "The improvements are established," he said. "The residence is established. The enterprise is bona fide and continuous, and I find no want of good faith in the proving up." He looked over the top of his spectacles at Deering. "The contest is dismissed. Costs to the contestant." He reached for his stamp, and he brought it down on the deed with a sound like a door shutting, and the sound of it went all through that room. The claim is upheld. The quarter belongs to Docia Ransom. Hollis Pruitt sat very still on his bench in his new coat. He'd wanted that water for his cattle. He'd wanted it back when it was a thing a man could take from a woman like her, back when he'd stood under the arbor and told 40 families that people like her always got handed the land the rest of them walked past. And now he watched a government stamp come down and put the coldest, richest water in the county into her name forever, out of his reach for good, while out on his own dry grass his herd stood gaunt in a drought no swamp of hers had made. He'd read the water wrong. He'd read her wrong. He had nothing to say, and for once in Ambrose nobody was waiting to hear him say it. He got up and he went out, and the drought went with him. Deering folded his soft leather folder over his dismissed contest and his costs, and Wexford Land and Loan withdrew from the matter, and was not heard from again on the subject of the flooded quarter. And the 40 families who had looked at their plates under the arbor rather than look at her, they came up after, one by one, hats in hands, and they did not quite know how to say the thing they'd come to say, so most of them just said they'd be needing ice, and could they buy it by the ton, and would she put them down in the ledger by name? She put them down by name. Every one. That was the summer she was proved right in a warm room. The winter proved her rich. January of 1885 came in hard and clear, and this time Docia Ransom did not walk out onto the black ice alone, before light, with a handsaw and a pair of worn tongs. This time there were 6 of them. A crew of 6, cutting the pond in gangs, the marking plow scoring the ice into a grid, the saws going, the blocks floating down the channel to the landing in a line like slow freight. 11 feet at the center, spring-fed, and every foot of it clear as a reed newspaper. And the ice went out. It went out farther than Ambrose now. It went to the butchers and creameries and eating houses and saloons of 3 counties, hauled out across the plains that had no other cold in them anywhere, the winter crop that cut itself and asked nothing of the soil. The wagons that came to her landing to load weren't all hers anymore. Some of them belonged to the very men who'd called it the widow's folly. They backed up to her ice house, and they loaded her ice with their own hands, and they paid her in her own front room, and they read her name at the top of the bill, above every other name, and they didn't say a word about a swamp. She'd wanted, once, only to own the water instead of cutting other men's ice for 40 cents a day. She owned the water now. She owned the cold in 3 counties, and she had a contract in her own name that the county had tried to unsay and could not. The pond thawed to silver in the spring. They were married on the landing, where else, with the water gone bright and open behind them and the reeds coming up green. The same neighbors came who'd once looked away, and this time they looked, and they lifted glasses with her ice glittering in the water, cold in April, because she was Docia Ransom, and there was no season in the year she couldn't hand you a piece of winter. Nell Hartzell carried the block. She came up the landing solemn as a bishop, with a clear square of pond ice held out in both her arms, and it sweated in the warm spring sun and threw its coin of gold light around, and she set it down where everyone could see. The wage tool of a woman who'd cut ice for other men her whole young life. The thing old Ezra had taught her to read to the sun 1,000 miles and 30 years ago. It stood there, melting slow at a wedding, clear all the way through, the emblem of a home built on the one crop nobody else could read. Elias took her hand at the altar, and he was her partner in the ledger already, and now he was her partner in the rest of it. The courtship that had been conducted in ice weights and delivery dates and a pair of mended tongs left without a word. It finished in vows, on the ice landing, over the water that never once lied to her. Afterward, when the glasses were empty and the light went long and gold across the pond the way it had the evening she'd asked him for paper instead of a handshake, Docia walked down to the water's edge alone for a minute. She looked out at the silver of it. She thought of the land agent who'd slid the papers across the counter, smiling like a man who'd sold the bottom of the barrel. She thought of 40 families looking at their plates. They walked past a fortune, she said, soft to the water. Every last one of them. And all because they couldn't read it cold. Then, she went back up the landing to her husband and his girl and her neighbors, to the ledger open on the board with a fresh contract laid in it, dated, signed in her own careful hand, her name at the top of the page. Hers, and no man's to unsay. If you've watched this far, tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Docia's story travels.